of righteous by faith in Abraham. Genesis chapter 12 verses 9 and 10, Genesis 12 verses 9 and 10, he passed through Canaan into the south of Egypt. So Egypt is the south. Isaiah 30 verses 1 to 3, Egypt is the south. Those that trust in the shadow of Egypt. Isaiah 30, 6 to 7. The burden of the beasts of the south. So you tie those two together, in the shadow of Egypt and the burdens of the beasts of the south. Egypt is the south. Egypt is the king of the south. But in 1798, the south is not literal Egypt. Okay, it's not literal Egypt. If you go to Revelation 11 verse 2, if you look at the time of that verse, it's actually taken you to 1798, the times of the Gentiles, the 42 months. Revelation 11 verses 3 and 4 also discuss that time period as well, when it talks about the witnesses, which are the Old and New Testament. So we went through Isaiah 31 to 3, Isaiah 30, 6 to 7, Revelation 11, 2, Revelation 11, 3 and 4. Ellen White comments on this. No, we'll skip the Ellen White. Ellen White's comment is in Great Controversy 267, speaking about the two witnesses, who they are. 267, Great Controversy 267. Revelation 11 verse 7, talking about those two witnesses, it says when they should be finishing their witness, or when they have finished it says when they finish their witness, but it actually should be when they're finishing their witness, just a little before 1798, the beast from the bottomless pit shall make war on them and kill them. That's the French Revolution that's being discussed in Revelation 11 verse 7. The next verse, verse 8, it says, the dead bodies lie in the street of the city, which is spiritually Egypt and Sodom. So there we see the connection in Revelation 11 verse 8, that France is spiritually Egypt and also Sodom. We discussed this verse the other evening, where from 1 Corinthians 15:46. 1 Corinthians 15:46, it says, howbeit that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterwards that which is spiritual. So first you have the natural, or the literal, then you have the spiritual. First you have literal Egypt, then you have spiritual Egypt. So what are the characteristics of Sodom? If you go to Jude 1:7 and 2 Peter 2:6, 2 Peter 2:6, I'm just going to paraphrase, that the characteristics of Sodom are fornication, strange flesh, immorality, and sexual deviant sins. So it's all to do with about lust and sexuality and deviations of those types. That's the characteristics of Sodom. What are the characteristics of Egypt? So we're picking up the characteristics of Egypt and Sodom because verse 8 of Revelation 11 says it was spiritually Egypt and Sodom. We've tackled Sodom, Egypt. Let's go to Exodus chapter 5 verses 1 and 2. Exodus chapter 5 verses 1 and 2. And this story here is really a story about how God's people are dealing with an atheistic power, because in the rejection of the Lord, Pharaoh does this basically. Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? I know not the Lord. And if you look at that phraseology, it's the very definition of atheism, that they don't know God. So we know that this rejection of God is a testimony that they're atheistic. They're also spiritualistic. They believe in spiritism or New Ageism. Pharaoh believed that he was God himself, or God was within him. So that's a clearly spiritualistic concept. If you go to Great Controversy 268 to 271, Ellen White comments on this, and she clearly tells you 268 to 271, Great Controversy. I'm just going to pick up some pertinent points there. And she talks about the Sodom and the atheistic nature of Egypt. And it says, according to the words of the prophet, then a little before the year 1798, some power of satanic origin and character would rise to make war upon the Bible, and in the land where the testimony of God's two witnesses should thus be silenced, there would be manifest atheism of Pharaoh and licentiousness of Sodom. This prophecy has received the most exact and striking fulfillment in the history of France during the Revolution of 1793, which then went on to 1798, as we've discussed. So we have quite a firm foundation to show that France is Egypt in that history. Great Controversy 268 to 271. So the south, or Egypt, is atheistic France during the French Revolution. It says, the king of the south shall push at him. Psalms 44, 4 to 6. Psalms 44, 4 to 6. I'm going to paraphrase again. It says, the enemies are pushed down through the name of God, not by the strength of bows and swords. So it's talking about this pushing down is referencing a warfare. So pushing down has a reference to warfare. Let's go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 4. Daniel 8 verse 4 says, the ram pushes west, north and south, so no one can stop it. Pushing is to do with warring and fighting. So this idea of pushing is an idea of fighting. So we have atheistic France in 1798 warring or fighting against the king of the north, the papacy. We could go through some Bible passages to actually show who the king of the north is, but I'm not going to do that because we've already shown quite clearly who the king of the north is. But there are quite a few Bible verses to show that who the king of the north is, but it's the papacy. So let's deal with this issue of what a whirlwind is, like a whirlwind. Psalms 58 verse 9. Before your pots can fill the thorns, he shall take them away as with a whirlwind, both living and in his wrath. So this idea of a whirlwind is taking or sweeping away. It's a sweeping away of something. Psalms 58 verse 9. Yeah? Psalm 58 verse 9. So how does he sweep away? The verse tells us he sweeps away with chariots, horsemen, and ships. Let's go to Proverbs 1:27. Proverbs 1:27. It says, when your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you. So when he comes with destruction, with the chariots, horsemen, and ships, this destruction comes like a whirlwind. So when he destroys this power, he destroys it like a whirlwind. So the sweeping away, or the taking away of the king of the south with destruction, so that he's no longer a threat and does not rise up. He's no longer a threat or a foe to the papacy as he comes to reign in his ascendancy. I had Proverbs 1:27. 1:27. When Egypt came against the papacy, it just said it pushed against him. But here it says, when the king of the north comes against, when the papacy comes against the USSR, he's going to come like a whirlwind. And this idea of whirlwind is this concept of a destruction. We need to concentrate on the Bible and not what we see in the world. If you look in the world, the USSR is actually doing pretty well now, both economically and politically in the world. It's back on the ascendancy. So you have to ask yourself the question, do you trust what the Bible is teaching, this interpretation, or do you go with the world? Because it says, in reference to prophecy, that the USSR is now out of the scene. It's no longer an opposing power to the papacy. But by our eyesight, it would not appear to be so. with chariots and horsemen. Exodus chapter 14 verse 9. Exodus 14 verse 9. Let's look at what chariots and horsemen are. But the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them encamping by the sea besides Pi-hahiroth before Baal-zephon. So associated with chariots and horsemen is military or an army. So it is an army or military strength. Ezekiel 37:20. Ezekiel 39:20. Ezekiel 39:20. Thus ye shall be filled at my table with horses and chariots, with mighty men, and with all the men of war, saith the Lord God. So associated with chariots and horses is men of war. Ships. When you come to the issue of ships, you're going to see that ships are represented both by military power, might, and also commerce. But if you look at the proportion of verses, the vast majority of verses that deal with ships actually deal with the issue of commerce and trade. They're not dealing with the military side of ships. There's only a few verses that deal with that. Psalms 107:23. Psalms 107 verse 23. They that go down to the sea in ships that do business in great waters. So the ships are connected to business, commerce, and economic trade. If you go to Revelation 18 verses 17 to 21, Revelation 18, 17 to 21, it says, For in 1 hour so great riches is come to naught, and every shipmaster and all the company of ships and sailors, and as many as trade by sea, stood afar off. So you see again, ships are connected to merchant trade. So we have here chariots, horsemen, and ships. This represents military power, and this represents economic power. So there are two forces that are brought to bear upon the USSR, which destroy like a whirlwind the USSR influence to come against or do harm to the papacy, and it's using military and economic strength. Another point that I want to pick up is the King of the South wars against the papacy. This is one country, and I'll use this idea that the King of the North is one country, although it's not a country per se, it's a religion, obviously, it's a church. When you come to this scenario here, we have this still same one country or one power, but when it comes to the USSR, it doesn't say it's a single country. The verse says, the King of the North will enter in through the countries and overflow and pass over. So it's picking up this term countries. And the reason it's doing that is because we know that the USSR is not Russia. It's Russia and its satellite states. And the thing that happened in this time frame, it wasn't so much the destruction of Russia as a country, it was the destruction of the union or the yoke that Russia had upon its satellite states. So that grip got broken down, and Russia is just a single entity now, a country. Overflow and pass over. Overflow and pass over. Isaiah chapter 8 verses 7 and 8. Isaiah chapter 8 verses 7 and 8. So I'm just going to paraphrase from that, and that verse is talking about a power that is likened to water, and he overflows his banks and conquers Israel. It's actually talking about the kingdom of Assyria, which is the same as the kingdom of Babylon. It talks about how it's rushing and overflowing to come and destroy Israel. So overflowing means to conquer a nation and have dominion and ruleship over it. And I just want to mention one last point here. I've dealt with all the imagery